The champagne flute trembled in Sarah Chun's hand as Flight 847 lurched violently to the left, sending passengers' screams echoing through the cabin like broken glass. At 35,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies, the small regional jet carrying 43 souls had just become a tomb hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah's bridesmaid, dress a soft lavender silk that her sister, Emma, had chosen specifically to complement her dark hair, was now wrinkled and stained with spilled drinks from the turbulence that had started 20 minutes ago and hadn't stopped. She pressed her face against the small oval window, watching the jagged peaks below grow larger with each terrifying second. The mountains that had looked so beautiful during takeoff from Denver now appeared as gray-black teeth waiting to devour them all. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice crackled through the intercom, but something was wrong. Captain Rodriguez's usually confident baritone was strained, breathless. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Sarah gripped the armrest harder, her knuckles white against her olive skin. She was supposed to be Emma's maid of honor in 6 hours. The rehearsal dinner was tonight at the Grand Lodge in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where 3 generations of the Hartwell family had celebrated their most important moments. Emma had been planning this wedding for 2 years, every detail meticulously arranged, from the mountain wildflower centerpieces to the string quartet that would play during the ceremony on the outdoor terrace overlooking the Tan Range. But now, as the plane shuddered again and dropped what felt like 100 feet in a single stomach-churning moment, Sarah wondered if she'd ever see her sister again. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been terrified of flying for years, only conquering her phobia last month with the help of a therapist and 3 sessions of exposure therapy. Emma had been so proud when Sarah finally booked the flight instead of driving the 12 hours from San Francisco. "Mom, I'm scared." The small voice came from the seat behind her. Sarah turned to see a boy, maybe 8 years old, clutching a worn stuffed elephant while his mother tried to comfort him with shaking hands. "It's okay, Tommy, just some bumpy air. Remember what we practiced? Deep breaths." The woman, Linda, Sarah had heard her introduce herself during boarding, looked like she was about to be sick. Her wedding ring caught the cabin light as she smoothed her son's sandy hair. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt despite the captain's instructions and turned around in her seat. As a pediatric nurse at UCSF Children's Hospital, she'd comforted thousands of frightened children over the past 8 years. "Hey there, Tommy. I like your elephant. What's his name?" The boy's tear-filled eyes met hers. "Peanut. He's been with me since I was little. Peanut looks very brave." Did you know elephants are some of the smartest animals in the world? They remember everything, every friend they've ever made, every place they've been safe. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small LED penlight she always carried. "Want to see something cool?" She clicked on the light and projected shadows on the seat back, a rabbit, then a bird. Tommy's sniffles quieted as he watched, mesmerized. Other passengers nearby began to pay attention, grateful for any distraction from the chaos outside. "Sarah, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, a man in his 50s sitting across the aisle. She'd noticed him during boarding because he was traveling alone but carried a photo of what looked like a large family, multiple generations, smiling at the camera. "I'm a retired air traffic controller. 28 years guiding planes safely home." His calm presence was immediately reassuring. Marcus had the kind of weathered face that spoke of countless emergencies handled with grace. Silver hair perfectly combed despite the turbulence. This kind of weather can create severe downdrafts in the mountains, but these pilots are trained for it. Captain Rodriguez has been flying these routes for 15 years. As if summoned by Marcus's words, The cockpit door burst open. "First Officer." Kim Harrison stumbled out, her usually immaculate uniform disheveled, her face pale as moonlight. Sarah had chatted with her briefly during boarding. Kim was 29, recently promoted, and had mentioned being excited about her upcoming engagement to her longtime girlfriend. "I need help." Kim's voice barely carried over the engine noise and passenger murmurs. "Is there a doctor on board? Anyone with medical training?" Sarah's heart stopped. She looked at Marcus, whose calm expression had shifted to one of deep concern. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez, a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes and 20 years of service experience, was already moving down the aisle despite the turbulence. "I'm a nurse," Sarah called out, standing carefully and using the seatbacks for balance. "What's wrong?" Kim's eyes found hers, and Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. Pure terror barely held in check. "It's Captain Rodriguez. He collapsed about 2 minutes ago. Chest pain, difficulty breathing, and Kim swayed on her feet, catching herself against a seat. "I don't feel well either. Nausea, dizziness. Something's wrong." The cabin fell silent except for the roar of engines and the whistle of wind outside. 43 people processed the implications of what they'd just heard. No pilots. 35,000 feet above some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. A regional jet that suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. Sarah looked around the cabin at faces frozen in disbelief. Linda held Tommy closer. Marcus was already unbuckling his seatbelt. An elderly couple near the back clutched each other's hands. A businessman who'd been working on his laptop throughout the flight stared at his screen as if the quarterly reports could somehow save them all. "How long until we reach Jackson Hole?" Sarah asked Kim, though she suspected they might never see the airport at all. 15 minutes if we maintain course and altitude." Kim slumped into an empty seat, her pilot's training warring with whatever was making her sick. "But I can barely stand, let alone fly. And the captain." She gestured helplessly toward the cockpit. Sarah had faced medical emergencies before, children coding in the middle of the night, accidents that brought families to their knees, moments when her training was all that stood between life and death. But those emergencies happened on solid ground, with backup systems and colleagues and hospitals nearby. This was different. This was physics and gravity and the unforgiving mathematics of a metal tube falling from the sky. She moved toward the cockpit, her bridesmaid heels clicking against the aisle floor. Through the open door, she could see Captain Rodriguez slumped over the controls, unconscious but breathing. The instrument panel looked like something from a science fiction movie, hundreds of lights, gauges, switches, and displays that might as well have been hieroglyphics. "Has anyone here ever flown a plane?" Marcus called out to the cabin. "Any pilots, current or former, military, private license, anything?" Silence. Sarah thought about Emma, probably getting her nails done right, now blissfully unaware that her older sister might not make it to the wedding. Emma, who had always been the adventurous one, the risk-taker, the sister who jumped off cliffs into mountain lakes while Sarah watched from the shore. Emma, who had begged her to overcome her fear of flying because life's too short to let fear make your decisions. The plane lurched again, and this time Sarah was sure they were losing altitude. The mountain peaks outside looked close enough to touch. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Emma 3 days ago, when her sister had called, nervous about some last-minute wedding drama, a vendor cancellation, family politics, the usual pre-wedding stress that seemed monumentally important until you were faced with your own mortality at 6 miles above the earth. "I love you, Em," she had said before hanging up, the same way they always ended their calls. The same words their parents had taught them to say after every conversation, because you never knew which goodbye might be your last. Now, looking at the unconscious pilot and the cockpit full of incomprehensible technology, Sarah realized that their parents' wisdom had never been more relevant. She pulled out her phone, knowing there was no signal at this altitude, and stared at the last text message Emma had sent her. "Can't wait to see you. The mountains are going to be perfect for photos. Love you, sis." The timestamp read, 11:42 a.m., just 23 minutes ago. Before the turbulence started. Before everything changed. Before 43 people found themselves in the hands of fate and the slim hope that someone, somehow could figure out how to land a plane they'd never been trained to fly. Sarah looked back at the cabin, at Tommy clutching Peanut, at Linda, trying to be strong, at Marcus already studying the emergency instruction cards, with the focused intensity of someone who understood that preparation was their only chance of survival. At Jessica, whose years of safety demonstration suddenly seemed like the most important education any of them had ever received. She thought about all the weddings she'd attended over the years, all the promises made in the face of an uncertain future. "Till death do us part," couples said, never really believing death would come calling on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. On what was supposed to be a routine flight to celebrate love and family and the simple joy of being alive. The radio crackled with a transmission from air. "Traffic control. Flight 847, please respond. We're showing irregular altitude readings. Confirm your status." No one answered because no one knew how. Sarah Chen had always been the responsible one. Even as a child in their suburban Sacramento home, while Emma was climbing trees and coming home with scraped knees and wild stories, Sarah was the daughter who made sure her homework was done, her room was clean, and her parents never had to worry. She was 10 when her father had his first heart attack, and she still remembered the sound her mother made when she got the call from the hospital, a keening cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. That night, while Emma slept soundly in the next bed, Sarah had lain awake making silent promises to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. She would be perfect. She would never cause her parents worry. She would become someone who saved lives instead of someone who needed saving. The path to pediatric nursing hadn't been a calling so much as a logical progression of that childhood promise. Sarah excelled at science, was naturally empathetic, and found that she could remain calm in crisis situations when others panicked. During her clinical rotations at UC Davis Medical Center, she discovered that she had an intuitive understanding of children's fears and an ability to comfort them that her supervisors called gifted. But if Sarah was honest with herself, and the therapy sessions she'd started 6 months ago were forcing her to be brutally honest, her choice of career was as much about control as it was about helping others. In the pediatric ICU, she could anticipate problems, prepare for emergencies, and create safe spaces in an unpredictable world. She thrived on protocols and procedures because they meant that chaos could be managed, that scary situations had step-by-step solutions. Flying was the opposite of everything Sarah valued about her ordered life. In an airplane, you surrendered control to pilots you'd never met, trusted your life to machines you didn't understand, and placed faith in weather patterns and air traffic controllers and 1,000 variables that could change in an instant. For years, this fear had shaped her choices. She drove to medical conferences instead of flying. She took her vacations within driving distance of home. She turned down job opportunities that would have required frequent travel. Emma had been patient about it for a long time, understanding that their father's sudden death from a second heart attack when Sarah was 22 had intensified her need for control. But last year, when Sarah had missed Emma's engagement party in Denver because she couldn't bring herself to book a flight, their relationship had reached a breaking point. "I know you're scared, but you're letting fear make decisions for both of us," Emma had said during a tearful video call after the party. "I wanted you there, Sarah. I needed my sister there when David proposed, and instead I had to explain to everyone why you weren't coming. I'm tired of working around your phobias." The words had stung because they were true. Sarah's fear of flying had become a barrier between her and the people she loved. It meant she saw her extended family less frequently, missed important events, and forced others to accommodate her limitations. When Emma announced that the wedding would be in Jackson Hole, David's family had connections to the area, and the venue had been booked for 3 years, Sarah faced a choice: overcome her fear or miss the most important day of her sister's life. The therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Nolan had been humbling. Sarah was used to being the helper, not the one needing help. She was used to being the strong one, the one others leaned on. Admitting that she needed professional assistance to board an airplane felt like a fundamental failure of her identity. "Your fear isn't irrational," Dr. Nolan had explained during their first session. "You experienced trauma at a young age when your father died suddenly and unexpectedly. Your nervous system developed hypervigilance as a protective mechanism. The fear of flying represents a loss of control that triggers those same neural pathways that were activated when you couldn't save your father." The exposure therapy had been gradual. First, they'd worked on relaxation techniques and breathing exercises. Then Sarah had visited the airport, just to sit in the terminal and watch planes take off. She'd taken a virtual reality flight simulation. Finally, 3 weeks ago, she'd booked a short flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles and back, just to prove to herself that she could do it. That flight had gone perfectly. Smooth takeoff, clear skies, professional crew, textbook landing. Sarah had felt almost silly about her years of avoidance. She'd called Emma from Lax, triumphant and proud. "I did it. I actually did it. See you at your wedding, little sister." Now, looking at Captain Rodriguez's unconscious form and feeling the plane continue its terrifying descent toward the Rocky Mountains, Sarah wondered if her fears had been prescient rather than pathological. Maybe her nervous system had been trying to protect her from exactly this situation. Maybe staying on the ground had been the right choice all along. But as she watched, Kim Harrison struggled to stay conscious in the passenger seat. Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her during medical emergencies. This was what she did. This was who she was. When children were hurt or scared or dying, Sarah became the person they needed her to be. Her personal fears disappeared, replaced by clinical focus and gentle competence. "Kim, I need you to stay with me," Sarah said, kneeling beside the young pilot. She checked Kim's pulse, rapid but steady, and looked into her eyes. The pupils were equal and reactive, which was good. "Can you tell me what symptoms you're experiencing?" "Nausea, dizziness, feeling weak." Kim's voice was barely audible over the engine noise. "Started about 10 minutes after Captain Rodriguez collapsed. I was trying to maintain altitude, trying to radio for help, but then everything started spinning." Sarah looked back at Captain Rodriguez. He was breathing regularly, and his color was better than Kim's, but he remained unresponsive. She had no medical equipment, no diagnostic tools, no way to determine what had caused both pilots to become incapacitated within minutes of each other. Food poisoning was possible, but they were on different meal schedules. Carbon monoxide leak was another possibility, but the passengers weren't showing symptoms. Sarah's mind ran through the differential diagnosis. The way she'd been trained, what could cause sudden onset of neurological symptoms in 2 healthy adults? "Jessica," Sarah called to the flight attendant, who was trying to calm passengers while monitoring the cockpit situation. "Did both pilots eat the same thing today? Drink from the same water source? Were they exposed to any cleaning chemicals or maintenance work before the flight?" Jessica's face was pale but determined. In her 20 years of service, she'd handled medical emergencies, unruly passengers, and severe turbulence, but never anything like this. They both had coffee from the crew room before boarding. Captain Rodriguez had a turkey sandwich from the airport deli. Kim brought her own salad from home. Marcus Webb had made his way to the front of the cabin and was studying the cockpit with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Sarah, I've been looking at the controls, and I need to be honest with you all. I know aircraft systems from an air traffic control perspective, but I've never actually flown anything larger than a Cessna, and that was 25 years ago. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces turned toward her, passengers who were beginning to understand that their survival might depend on decisions made by people with no real authority or expertise. Tommy was crying quietly into peanuts. Worn fur. Linda looked like she was praying. The elderly couple near the back were holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. What about autopilot? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why she was the one asking questions. Maybe because she was kneeling next to the incapacitated pilot. Maybe because her years of medical training had taught her to take charge in emergencies. Maybe because everyone was looking at her with desperate hope, and she couldn't bring herself to disappoint them. That's the thing, Marcus said, pointing to a series of amber warning lights on the instrument panel. I think something's wrong with the flight management system. These indicators suggest we're not maintaining our programmed course or altitude. And look at this. He pointed to a screen showing what looked like a weather radar display. That's a significant storm system moving in from the west. The autopilot might be trying to avoid it, but without proper navigation input. He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood the implication. The plane was flying itself, but not necessarily toward safety. They were like passengers in a car whose driver had passed out while the cruise control was still engaged, moving forward at high speed with no one steering toward a destination. Kim stirred in her seat, and Sarah immediately focused on her again. Kim, I know you're not feeling well, but I need to ask you something important. If someone with no flight training wanted to try to communicate with air traffic control, how would they do that? Kim's eyes focused on Sarah with tremendous effort. Are a DIO headset on the captain's head. Push the transmit button on the yoke, the steering wheel thing. But Sarah ... Kim's voice became more urgent despite her weakness. Even if you can talk to a TC landing this plane ... It takes thousands of hours of training. The approach speeds, the configuration changes, the touchdown technique. I've been flying for 6 years, and some landings still challenge me. Sarah thought about Emma's wedding, which was supposed to start in 5 hours and 47 minutes. She thought about the vows Emma and David had written, promises about facing life's challenges together, about being each other's safe harbor in every storm. She thought about how Emma had joked that Sarah's fear of flying was really a fear of not being in control, and how her little sister had gently suggested that maybe learning to trust others was a skill worth developing. What if we don't try to land the plane ourselves? Sarah asked suddenly. What if we try to get it to an airport where someone else could talk us through it step by step? Marcus looked skeptical. Sarah, I've guided thousands of flights safely to ground, but I've never talked someone through actually flying. That's not what air traffic controllers do. We manage traffic separation and provide navigation guidance, but the pilots are the ones who actually control the aircraft. But pilots train in simulators, right? Sarah was thinking out loud now, her mind working the same way it did when she was trying to diagnose a complex case. They practice emergency scenarios. Someone somewhere must have thought about what to do if passengers needed to land the plane. There have to be protocols, procedures, checklists. Jessica moved closer to the cockpit. I've heard stories, she sighed quietly. Passengers who had to take over when pilots became incapacitated. I think some of them made it. Some of them, Marcus repeated grimly. Which means some of them didn't. Sarah looked out the cockpit window at the landscape below. The mountains were breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly close. Snow-capped peaks stretched to the horizon, carved by ancient glaciers into sharp ridges and deep valleys. It was the kind of scenery that belonged on postcards and calendars, The kind of wilderness that people traveled thousands of miles to experience safely from the ground. She thought about her father's funeral. How the pastor had talked about faith being the opposite of control, about trusting in things beyond our understanding. Sarah had rejected those words at the time she was 22 and angry, and determined to never again be helpless in the face of disaster. She'd spent the next 13 years building a life based on preparation, knowledge, and careful risk. Management. But now, at 35,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies, with 2 unconscious pilots and 43 lives hanging in the balance, Sarah realized that all her careful planning had led her to this moment of ultimate uncertainty. She could try to help land the plane and possibly kill everyone on board. Or she could do nothing and definitely kill everyone on board. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Okay," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Marcus, can you help me figure out how to use the radio? We need to tell someone what's happening and find out if there's an airport within range where they might be able to talk us down." Kim struggled to sit up straighter. "Sarah, you don't understand. Landing an airplane isn't like driving a car. The physics are completely different. The speeds, the angles, the coordination required. People spend years learning how to do it safely." Sarah looked at Kim with the same gentle firmness she used with frightened children in the hospital. "I know, but Kim, people also spend years learning how to perform heart surgery. And sometimes a paramedic in an ambulance has to crack open someone's chest to save their life. We work with the training we have and the situation we're in." She stood up and looked back at the cabin full of passengers who were depending on her to make an impossible decision. "I'm not saying I can land this plane. I'm saying we have to try, because the alternative is accepting that we're all going to die, and I'm not ready to do that." Tommy's small voice carried from the back of the cabin. "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah met his frightened eyes and felt the same protective instinct that had driven her to become a nurse, the same determination that had helped her overcome her fear of flying, the same love that was carrying her toward her sister's wedding. "Despite everything that could go wrong, we're going to try our very best," she told him, and meant it. The radio crackled to life before Sarah could figure out how to use it. "Flight 847 Denver Center. We're showing you at flight level 280 and descending. Please confirm your altitude and intentions." Sarah looked at Marcus, who was already reaching for the headset on Captain Rodriguez's motionless head. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice was steady when he pressed the transmit button on the control yoke. "Denver Center, this is not Flight 847's crew. We have a passenger emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated, and we need immediate assistance." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, the whistle of wind outside, the collective held breath of 43. People waiting for salvation from a voice in the sky. "Aircraft calling Denver Center, say again. Did you say both pilots are incapacitated?" "Affirmative. This is Marcus Webb, retired air traffic controller. I have a regional jet with 43 souls on board. Captain is unconscious. First officer is conscious but severely impaired. We need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and emergency assistance." Another pause, then a different voice came through the radio, calmer, more authoritative. "Marcus, this is Denver Center Supervisor Jake Morrison. I'm coordinating with our emergency response team. Can you tell me the current condition of your pilots and whether anyone on board has flight experience?" Sarah moved closer to the microphone. "This is Sarah Chen. I'm a nurse." Both pilots became ill within minutes of each other. Captain Rodriguez is unconscious but breathing normally. First Officer Harrison is conscious but experiencing severe nausea and dizziness. No one on board has significant flight experience. "Sarah, Jake Morrison here. I need you to look at the instrument panel and tell me what you see on the primary flight display. That's the screen directly in front of the captain's seat. Sarah studied the bewildering array of gauges and digital displays. There are numbers that keep changing. Altitude shows 27,400. Airspeed shows 340. There's a line across the screen that seems to be moving up and down, ... Okay, good. You're looking at the artificial horizon. The line represents the relationship between your aircraft and the actual horizon. Sarah, I need you to understand something. We're going to get you through this, but it's going to require you to trust us completely and follow instructions exactly. Marcus took the headset back. Jake, this is Marcus. What's our best option for a landing site? I know the terrain around here, and most airports are going to be challenging for an inexperienced pilot. Marcus, we're looking at several options. Grand Junction is 180 miles southeast with a long runway and good weather, but you'd need to maintain controlled flight for another 25 minutes. Closer options include Eagle County, but that airport has terrain challenges. Denver International is behind you now and would require a significant course change. Sarah felt the plane lurch again, this time more violently than before. Several passengers cried out, and the sound of someone being sick echoed from the back of the cabin. She looked at the altimeter and watched the numbers spinning downward. 26,800, 26,600, 26,400. Jake, we're losing altitude, Marcus reported. His air traffic control training evident in his clipped, professional tone. I don't think we have 25 minutes. Understood. Stand by. Jessica appeared at Sarah's shoulder, her face pale but determined. Sarah, I need to tell you something. I've been doing safety demonstrations for 20 years, and I know these aircraft systems better than most passengers, but I've never actually operated the flight controls. However, I do know the emergency procedures, and I know how to configure the cabin for an emergency landing. What does that mean exactly? Sarah asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. It means if we're going to attempt a landing, we need to prepare the passengers. Brace positions, loose items secured, emergency exits identified, and ... Jessica's voice dropped to a whisper. And we need to prepare them for the possibility that we might not succeed. The radio crackled again. Flight 847, Denver Center. We're vectoring you toward Eagle County Regional Airport. It's 60 miles northeast of your current position. The runway is shorter than ideal, but the weather is clear and the terrain is more forgiving than other options. Sarah looked out the cockpit window at the landscape rushing by below. The mountains were beautiful and terrifying, their snow-covered peaks reaching toward the plane like grasping fingers. She thought about Emma, probably getting her hair done. By now, unaware that her sister was facing the most challenging situation of her life. Jake, how much time do we have? Sarah asked into the microphone. At your current descent rate and ground speed, approximately 18 minutes until you need to begin your approach to Eagle County. Sarah, I'm going to patch you through to Captain Torres. She's one of our emergency response specialists, and she's successfully talked passengers through aircraft landings before. Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Someone's done this before? Twice. In the last 15 years. Once in Kansas with a small private plane. Once in Florida with a twin-engine aircraft. Both were successful, but I need you to understand, this is going to be the most difficult thing you've ever attempted. A new voice came through the radio, warm but authoritative. Sarah, this is Captain Torres. I need you to listen carefully to everything I tell you, and I need you to trust that we can do this together. But first, I need to know, are you comfortable taking control of the aircraft? Sarah looked at the yoke, the pedals on the floor, the bewildering array of switches and gauges that controlled the delicate balance between life and death. Every instinct she'd developed over 35 years of careful living screamed at her to say no, to find someone else, to avoid the responsibility of 43 lives. But then she thought about Tommy clutching his stuffed elephant, About Linda, trying to be brave for her son. About Marcus using his decades of experience to help strangers. About Jessica preparing to do whatever was necessary to save her passengers. She thought about Emma waiting at the altar tomorrow, and about her father's voice telling her that sometimes you have to act even when you're scared. "Yes," Sarah said into the microphone, "I'll try." "Good. Now very gently, put your hands on the yoke. That's the control wheel in front of you. Don't try to steer yet. Just feel how the aircraft responds to the air currents." Sarah wrapped her fingers around the unfamiliar controls and immediately felt the plane's movement translate through the metal and plastic into her hands. It was like holding the reins of an enormous, powerful horse. She could sense the aircraft's desire to fly, its responsiveness to every tiny input. "I can feel it," she said, wonder creeping into her voice despite their desperate situation. "Excellent. That's your connection to the aircraft now. Sarah, flying is about small, gentle movements. Never jerk the controls. Never make sudden changes. Think of it as dancing with the airplane rather than fighting it." Behind her, Sarah could hear Jessica explaining the situation to the passengers, her voice calm and professional despite the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to attempt an emergency landing at Eagle County Regional Airport. I need everyone to review the safety card in your seat pocket and prepare for emergency landing procedures." The elderly couple Sarah had noticed. Earlier, she'd heard them introduce themselves as Robert and Helen Morrison. Married 52 years, were holding hands and speaking quietly to each other. She caught fragments of their conversation. Always said we'd go together. Proud of the life we built. The grandchildren, we love them. Tommy's voice rose above the murmur of concerned passengers. "Mom, I don't want to crash." Linda's response was barely audible but carried clearly in the strained silence. "Tommy, remember what we talked about being brave? Sometimes being brave means doing something scary because it's the right thing to do. The lady up front is being very brave to help all of us." Sarah felt the weight of everyone's trust settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. In the pediatric ICU, she'd held the lives of children in her hands many times, but those decisions were made with years of training, teams of specialists, and sophisticated medical equipment. This was different. This was improvisation in the face of physics and weather and the unforgiving mathematics of flight. "Captain Torres, what happens if I make a mistake?" Sarah asked quietly into the microphone. "Sarah, you're going to make mistakes. Everyone does when they're learning to fly. The key is making small mistakes and correcting them quickly. The aircraft wants to fly. Your job is to guide it, not force it." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Sarah felt the controls buck in her hands. Instinctively, she gripped tighter and tried to hold the yoke steady, but Captain Torres's voice cut through her panic. "Gentle pressure, Sarah. Let the airplane ride through the turbulence. You're fighting it instead of working with it." Sarah loosened her grip and felt the plane settle into a more stable attitude. It was counterintuitive in every other situation she'd faced. Success had come from taking firm control and imposing order on chaos. But flying seemed to require a different approach, a willingness to cooperate with forces beyond her control. "Better," Captain Torres said. "Now I need you to look at the altimeter, the gauge that shows your height above sea level." "What does it read?" 24,800 feet, Sarah reported. "Good. Eagle County Airport sits at 6,540 feet above sea level, so you'll need to descend about 18,000 feet over the next 15 minutes. That's going to require some power adjustments and attitude changes. Sarah, are you ready to learn how to fly an airplane?" Sarah looked back at the cabin one more time. Marcus was studying the approach charts that Jessica had found in the cockpit, his experienced eyes trying to make sense of the symbols and numbers that would guide them to the runway. Kim Harrison was sitting with passengers now, still pale and weak, but trying to help by answering questions about aircraft systems. Tommy caught Sarah's eye and held up his stuffed elephant. "Peanut says thank you," he called out, his 8-year-old voice carrying more courage than Sarah felt. She turned back to the controls and keyed the microphone. "Captain Torres, I'm ready." "Excellent. First, we're going to reduce power to begin a controlled descent. Look for 2 levers near your right hand. Those are the throttles. Very slowly, pull them back about an inch." Sarah found the throttles and eased them backward. Immediately, she felt the plane's attitude change as the engine spooled down and the nose began to drop. The sensation was stomach-churning, like the moment at the top of a roller coaster when gravity takes over. "Good. Now you're going to learn about trim. Flying an airplane isn't about constant pressure on the controls. It's about setting the aircraft up to fly itself in the attitude you want. There should be a small wheel or electric trim tab near your left hand." Sarah found the trim control and adjusted it according to Captain Torres's instructions. Miraculously, the pressure on the yoke eased and the plane began to fly itself in a gentle descent. "I can't believe that worked." Sarah breathed into the microphone. "Sarah, you're doing beautifully. Now let's talk about navigation." "Marcus, are you there?" Marcus took the headset. "I'm here, Captain Torres. I need you to help Sarah with the GPS system. On the center console, there should be a screen showing a moving map. Can you see it?" "Yes, I see it. There's a purple line that seems to be leading toward an airport symbol." "Perfect. That's your flight plan to Eagle County. Sarah, your job now is to keep the airplane roughly following that purple line. Small adjustments with the yoke. If you drift to the left of the line, gently turn right. If you drift right, gently turn left." Sarah made her first intentional control input, a tiny pressure to the right, and watched in amazement as the aircraft responded. The plane banked slightly, and the purple line on the GPS began to center itself on the screen. "It's working," she said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a glimmer of hope, but that hope was immediately challenged by a new crisis. Kim Harrison, who had been sitting quietly with the passengers, suddenly stood up and swayed dangerously. "I think I'm going to be sick again," she announced, and then collapsed into the aisle. Jessica rushed to help her, and Sarah realized that whatever had affected both pilots was getting worse, not better. If it was some kind of poisoning or contamination, how long before it affected other people on board? How long before it affected her? "Captain Torres, our first officer, just collapsed again. I'm worried that whatever made both pilots sick might be spreading." "Understood, Sarah. That makes time even more critical. I need you to increase your descent rate. We're going to try to get you on the ground as quickly as possible." The next few minutes were a blur of instructions and adjustments. Sarah learned to coordinate her turns with the rudder pedals at her feet, to manage the aircraft's energy by trading altitude for airspeed, to interpret the bewildering array of information displayed on the flight instruments. Outside the cockpit windows, the Colorado landscape was breathtaking and terrifying. Deep valleys carved by ancient rivers, peaks that scraped the sky, forests that stretched to the horizon like green carpets. It was the kind of wilderness that made humans feel small and insignificant, the kind of terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. "Sarah, you're doing great, but I need to prepare you for what's coming next," Captain Torres said. "Landing an airplane is the most challenging part of flying. You're going to need to configure the aircraft, manage your approach speed, and coordinate several systems simultaneously." Marcus, who had been studying the approach charts, looked up with concern. "Captain Torres, I'm looking at the approach to Eagle County, and this is a mountain airport with terrain on all sides. Are you sure this is our best option?" "Marcus, it's our only realistic option given your fuel state and descent rate. But you're right, this is going to be challenging even for experienced pilots." Sarah felt her confidence evaporating. In the hospital, she'd always been able to ask for help, to call in specialists, to transfer patients to facilities with better equipment. Here she was the specialist. She was the last resort. And she had no idea what she was doing. The radio crackled with a transmission from Eagle County Airport. Flight 847, Eagle County Tower. We have emergency vehicles standing by. Runway 25 is your longest available runway at 9,000 feet. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. We're cleared all other traffic from the area. Sarah thought about Emma's wedding again, about the vows her sister would take tomorrow, about facing challenges together, about supporting each other through better and worse. She thought about her father, who had died suddenly without warning, and about her mother, who had somehow found the strength to raise 2 daughters alone. Captain Torres, what if I can't do this? What if I kill everyone? Sarah, listen to me carefully. In 15 years of emergency response, I've learned that the people who succeed in impossible situations aren't the ones who aren't afraid. They're the ones who act despite their fear. You've already proven you can fly this airplane. Now you just need to trust yourself to land it. Behind her, Sarah could hear the passengers preparing for what might be their final moments. Some were praying, others were writing notes on whatever paper they could find. Robert Morrison was telling his wife Helen about their first date 53 years ago. Tommy was explaining to Peanut that elephants were very good at remembering, so even if something bad happened, Peanut would remember all the good times they'd had together, the humanity of it all, the love, the fear, the courage, the quiet dignity with which people faced their mortality reminded Sarah why she had become a nurse in the first place. It wasn't about controlling outcomes or preventing all suffering. It was about being present in moments of crisis, about offering skill and compassion when they were needed most. I'm ready, she told Captain Torres. Tell me how to land this airplane. The next phase of their descent brought new challenges. Captain Torres talked Sarah through extending the landing gear, which caused the plane to shudder and slow dramatically. Then came the flaps, which changed the aircraft's handling characteristics and required constant trim adjustments. Sarah, you're now flying a completely different airplane than you were 5 minutes ago, Captain Torres explained. The gear and flaps create drag, which slows you down but also makes the aircraft want to pitch nose down. You'll need to add power to maintain your glide path. The concept of a glide path was terrifying, the idea that their path was an invisible 3-dimensional corridor in the sky that led to the runway, and that deviating from it meant either crashing short of the airport or overshooting into the mountains. Beyond, Captain Torres, I can see the airport, Sarah reported. Eagle County Regional Airport looked impossibly small from their current altitude, a narrow strip of concrete carved into the mountainous terrain. The runway looked like a ruler. Someone had dropped among the peaks. Good, Sarah. Now comes the most critical part. I need you to focus on the runway and nowhere else. Don't look at the mountains. Don't look at the terrain. Just focus on that strip of concrete. You're going to aim for the numbers painted at the beginning of the runway. Marcus was monitoring the GPS and calling out their distance. 3 miles. From the runway 2.5 2 miles. Sarah felt the plane sink below the mountain ridges, and suddenly the illusion of safety that altitude had provided was gone. They were committed now. There was no going around, no second chance, no option but to get this right the first time. The runway grew larger in the windscreen, but it still looked impossibly narrow. Sarah had driven on highways wider than the strip of concrete she was, aiming for at 120 miles per hour. Power back, Sarah. You're a little high and fast. Reduce power and let the nose come down slightly. Sarah pulled back on the throttles and felt the plane settle into what she hoped was the correct glide path. The mountains on either side of the runway seemed close enough to touch. She understood now why Captain Torres had said this was challenging, even for experienced pilots. 1 mile from the runway, Marcus called out. Looking good, Sarah. But something was wrong. Sarah could feel it in the way the aircraft was responding to her inputs. The controls felt mushy, unresponsive. The plane seemed to be wallowing in the air rather than flying cleanly. Captain Torres, something's wrong. The plane doesn't feel right. Sarah, you're getting slow. Add power immediately and lower the nose slightly. You're approaching a stall. The airplane's about to stop flying. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the engine spool up, but the runway was approaching fast now, too fast. She was high and fast and running out of time to correct her mistakes. The numbers at the beginning of the runway were clearly visible now, 25, painted in large white numerals on black asphalt. Sarah aimed for them and tried to remember everything Captain Torres had told her about the landing flare, about reducing power at the right moment, about holding the aircraft just above the runway until it settled gently onto the concrete. Instead, the plane hit the runway hard enough to bounce back into the air. Sarah's heart stopped as they became airborne again, the runway flashing by beneath them at tremendous speed. Power to idle, Sarah. Get the nose down and stay on the runway. Sarah yanked the throttles back and pushed forward on the yoke. The plane hit the runway again, this time staying down but traveling at what felt like highway speed. She could see the end of the runway approaching, and beyond that, a mountain that would kill them all if they couldn't stop in time. Brakes, Sarah. There should be pedals at the top of the rudder pedals. Push down on them. Sarah found the brake, pedals, and pressed down. The plane lurched and slowed, but the end of the runway was still coming up fast. She pressed harder on the brakes, and the aircraft began to shudder and shake as the wheels fought for traction on the asphalt. They were slowing down, but not fast enough. The mountain at the end of the runway filled the windscreen like a wall of rock and snow. Sarah closed her eyes and pressed the brake pedals to the floor, feeling the airplane shudder and protest as it fought against its own momentum. And then, impossibly, they stopped. The silence was deafening after the roar of engines and the screech of brakes. Sarah opened her eyes and saw that they were sitting on the runway, stationary, alive. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward them, their red, blue lights flashing against the mountain backdrop behind her. The cabin erupted in cheers and tears and laughter. Tommy was holding Peanut above his head like a trophy. Linda was crying and laughing simultaneously. Robert and Helen Morrison were kissing like teenagers. Marcus was shaking his head in amazement. Flight 847, Eagle County Tower. Welcome to Colorado. Emergency vehicles are approaching your aircraft. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the microphone. Captain Torres, we're down. We're safe. We made it. Sarah, you just accomplished something extraordinary. You should be very proud. As the first paramedics boarded the aircraft to check on Captain Rodriguez and Kim Harrison, Sarah realized that she had missed Emma's rehearsal dinner. But more importantly, she would be there for the wedding tomorrow. She would walk down the aisle in her lavender bridesmaid dress and stand beside her sister as she promised to face life's challenges with courage and love. She thought about the conversation she would have with Emma about fear and control and trust. About how sometimes the scariest moments led to the most profound growth. About how love for family, for strangers, for life itself could give people the strength to do impossible things. The sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that matched her bridesmaid dress. Tomorrow, Emma would marry David with the Rocky Mountains as their backdrop, surrounded by family and friends and the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful celebrations come after the most frightening journeys. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up on unsteady legs. She had learned to fly an airplane, but more importantly, she had learned something about herself. She was stronger than she had imagined, braver than she had believed, and capable of rising to challenges she had never thought possible. As she walked back through the cabin to check on the passengers she had helped save. Sarah realized that her fear of flying had been transformed into something else entirely, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And that, she thought, was probably the best wedding gift she could give her sister, proof that love really could conquer fear, that family really was worth any risk, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that scared you the most. The first revelation came as the paramedics were examining Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Harrison. Dr. Michael Chang, the senior emergency physician who had rushed to the airport from Vail Valley Medical Center, emerged from the cockpit. With a puzzled expression and a small device that looked like a carbon monoxide detector. "Sarah, I need to speak with you privately," Dr. Chang said, pulling her aside as the other passengers were being evacuated through the aircraft's emergency exits. "I've been monitoring both pilots, and their symptoms don't match any standard medical emergency. Their blood oxygen levels are normal, neurological responses are improving, and neither show signs of food poisoning or cardiac events." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air now flowing through the open cabin door. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever incapacitated your pilots was environmental, not medical. And it appears to be resolving. Now that you're on the ground." Dr. Chang held up the device in his hand. "This is reading elevated levels of a chemical compound that shouldn't be present in aircraft cabin air." Before Sarah could process the implications of this discovery, FBI agent Rebecca Foster approached them, her badge clearly visible on her dark blazer. Agent Foster had been at Eagle County Airport on an unrelated investigation when Flight 847's emergency was declared, and protocol required federal involvement whenever mysterious pilot incapacitation occurred. "Miss Chen, I understand you're the passenger who landed this aircraft. I need to ask you some questions about the flight. But first, did you notice anything unusual during boarding or the early part of the flight? Any strange odors, unusual passenger behavior, or maintenance activity around the aircraft?" Sarah's mind raced back to the boarding process. She remembered being impressed by how clean and well-maintained the aircraft appeared. She remembered the crew's professionalism during the safety demonstration. She remembered ... Wait, Sarah said suddenly. There was something. During boarding, I noticed a maintenance worker in the galley area. He was working on something near the coffee makers, and when Jessica, the flight attendant, asked him about it, he said he was fixing a ventilation issue. Agent Foster and Dr. Chang exchanged significant looks. "Can you describe this person?" Agent Foster asked. Mid-30s, wearing standard airline maintenance coveralls with a badge, but ... Sarah paused, trying to recall details. "But he seemed nervous. Most maintenance workers I've observed in hospitals are confident, methodical. This man kept looking around, checking his watch." Dr. Chang held up his detector again. "The chemical signature I'm detecting is consistent with a compound that could be introduced into the aircraft's air conditioning system. In high concentrations, it would cause exactly the symptoms your pilots experienced: nausea, dizziness, loss of consciousness." The second revelation came when Agent Foster received a call on her secure phone. She stepped away to take it, but her face grew increasingly grim as she listened. When she returned, her expression was grave. "Miss Chun, I need you to understand that what happened to your flight was not an accident. We've just learned that the maintenance worker you describe was not authorized to be on that aircraft. His credentials were falsified, and security footage shows him accessing the environmental systems approximately 40 minutes before your scheduled departure." Sarah felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. "You're saying someone deliberately tried to crash our plane?" "We're still investigating the motives, but yes, this appears to have been an intentional act. The compound introduced into your air system was designed to incapacitate the flight crew gradually, creating exactly the scenario you faced. Jessica Martinez, who had been helping passengers gather their belongings, overheard the conversation and approached with a stricken expression. "Agent Foster, I need to tell you something. That maintenance worker, I remember him now. He asked me specific questions about our crew schedules, about which pilots were flying today, about our passenger manifest." The third revelation emerged when Agent Foster's phone rang again. This time, she put the call on speaker so Sarah and the others could hear. "Agent Foster, this is Denver FBI field office. We've arrested the individual who posed as a maintenance worker. His name is Derek Molloy, and he's claiming this was part of a larger protest against aviation safety regulations. He says he never intended for anyone to die. He thought the pilots would be able to make an emergency landing before losing consciousness." Sarah felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. A protest? He risked the lives of 43 people for a protest? Agent Foster nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, we see this kind of extremist thinking more frequently than the public realizes. Individuals who become convinced that dramatic acts are necessary to draw attention to their causes without fully considering the consequences." The fourth revelation came from an unexpected source. Tommy, the 8-year-old boy who had been so frightened during the flight, tugged on Sarah's sleeve as she stood near the aircraft discussing the investigation. "Miss Sarah, I need to tell you something important," Tommy said, his young voice serious beyond his years. "During boarding, I saw the maintenance man put something in his pocket after he worked on the coffee thing. It looked like a small bottle or container." Agent Foster knelt down to Tommy's eye level. "That's very observant. Tommy, can you tell me anything else about what you saw?" He threw the bottle in the trash can by the gate before he left. "Mommy always tells me not to litter, so I noticed when people don't throw things away properly." Agent Foster immediately called the airport maintenance crew to secure the gate area and search for any evidence Tommy had described. Within an hour, they had recovered a small glass vial with residue that matched the chemical compound Dr. Chen had detected in the aircraft. The fifth revelation was perhaps the most disturbing. When investigators examined Derek Molloy's background, they discovered that he had specifically targeted Flight 847 because he knew it carried passengers traveling to what he considered elite social events, weddings, reunions, and celebrations at expensive mountain resorts. "He viewed your flight as a symbol of economic inequality," Agent Foster explained to Sarah as they sat in the airport's administrative office. "In his manifesto, yes, he had a manifesto. He wrote about targeting people he perceived as privileged, people who could afford to fly to destination weddings, while others struggled financially." Sarah thought about her fellow passengers. Linda, a single mother working 2 jobs to take her son to visit his grandparents. Robert and Helen Morrison, retirees who had saved for months to attend their granddaughter's college graduation. Marcus, a retired air traffic controller flying to his brother's funeral. The idea that anyone would view them as symbols of privilege was both tragic and infuriating. The sixth revelation came when Captain Torres arrived at Eagle County Airport to debrief with Sarah about the emergency landing. Sarah had been expecting a standard post-incident interview, but Captain Torres had brought something unexpected: footage from the airline's flight simulator center. "Sarah, I want you to see something," Captain Torres said, setting up a laptop in the conference room where they were meeting. "After we talked you through that landing, our instructors ran the same scenario in our most advanced simulator. Professional pilots with thousands of hours of experience, flying the exact same aircraft type you landed today." The video showed 3 different simulator sessions. In the first, an experienced captain struggled with the approach and had to go around twice before successfully landing. In the second, a senior first officer managed the landing but used nearly the entire runway and activated multiple warning systems. In the third session, an airline training instructor successfully landed but admitted afterward that was one of the most challenging scenarios he had ever attempted. "Sarah, What you accomplished today landing an aircraft you'd never flown before at a mountain airport, under extreme stress, with no formal training, it shouldn't have been possible. Our flight instructors are calling it one of the most remarkable examples of crisis management they've ever witnessed. The seventh revelation was more personal. Emma arrived at Eagle County Airport 3 hours after the landing, having driven from Jackson Hole the moment she heard about the emergency. Sarah had expected her sister to be relieved, grateful, maybe even impressed by what had happened. Instead, Emma was furious. "Do you understand what you put us through?" Emma said, her wedding dress still in the car outside, her eyes red from crying. "When we heard that Flight 847 had declared an emergency with pilot incapacitation, when we heard that a passenger had to land the plane... Sarah, I thought I had lost my sister the day before my wedding." Sarah was taken aback by Emma's reaction. She had expected praise, celebration, maybe even recognition of how she had overcome her fear of flying in the most dramatic way possible. "Emma, I had to try to land the plane. There wasn't any choice. If you hadn't, maybe the pilots would have recovered in time. Maybe air traffic control could have guided the plane remotely. Maybe there were other options that didn't involve you risking your life and the lives of everyone on board." The argument that followed was unlike any they had ever had. Emma accused Sarah of being reckless, of taking unnecessary risks, of always needing to be the hero. Sarah accused Emma of being ungrateful, of not understanding the impossible situation they had faced, of caring more about her wedding than her sister's life. It was Marcus Webb who finally intervened, his calm air traffic controller voice cutting through their emotional storm. "Ladies, with respect, you're both reacting to trauma. Emma, your sister saved 43 lives today, including her own. Sarah, your sister has been planning this wedding for 2 years, and today she experienced the worst fear any family member can face: the possibility of losing someone they love. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The eighth revelation came the next morning, just hours before Emma's wedding was scheduled. To begin, Dr. Chen called Sarah with the results of the full toxicology analysis on the chemical compound Derek Molloy had introduced into the aircraft's air system. "Sarah, we've identified the specific compound, and I need you to understand something important. The concentration levels we detected were much higher than what would be necessary to cause the symptoms your pilots experienced. If you had remained at altitude for another 10 to 15 minutes, everyone on board would have been affected." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Derek Molloy's protest had been a death sentence in disguise. His claim that he never intended to kill anyone was either a lie or a product of stunning ignorance about the effects of his actions. "Dr. Chang, are you saying that we would have died if we hadn't landed when we did?" "I'm saying that your decision to attempt an emergency landing, as dangerous as it was, saved everyone on that aircraft. By bringing the plane down quickly, you prevented prolonged exposure to concentrations that would have been fatal." Sarah sat in her hotel room at the Grand Lodge, her bridesmaid dress hanging in the closet, processing the weight of this final revelation. She had spent the night wrestling with Emma's accusations, wondering if she had been reckless, if there had been better options, if her need to take control had put people at unnecessary risk. Now she understood that the opposite was true. Every decision she had made, from taking control of the aircraft to attempting the challenging landing at Eagle County, had been not just brave, but necessary for survival. The recognition came in waves throughout that morning. Phone calls from family members who had seen the news reports. Messages from colleagues at UCSF Children's Hospital who were proud of their fellow nurses' courage. An email from Dr. Nolan, her therapist, noting the irony that Sarah had conquered her fear of flying by learning to fly in the most dramatic circumstances possible, The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Tommy and Linda arrived at the hotel that morning, having driven from Denver to attend Emma's wedding as uninvited but welcome guests. "Miss Sarah, I wanted to give you something," Tommy said, holding out his worn stuffed elephant. "Peanut wants to stay with you because you're the bravest person he's ever met." Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level, remembering how she had comforted him during those terrifying moments in the air. "Tommy, Peanut belongs with you. But maybe we can make a deal. Maybe Peanut can help you remember that sometimes scary things happen, but there are always people who will try to help." Linda hugged Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. Tommy and I were flying to see his grandmother. She's been sick, and we thought this might be our last chance. Because of you, he'll get to say goodbye." The recognition that mattered most came 2 hours before the wedding ceremony, when Emma appeared at Sarah's hotel room door. Her sister was already dressed in her wedding gown, a stunning creation of silk and lace that had taken months to design and fit perfectly. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," Emma said, her voice quiet and sincere. "I was scared and angry and looking for someone to blame for almost losing you. But I've been thinking about it all night, and I realized something you didn't choose to be put in that situation, but when you were, you did exactly what I would have wanted you to do. You fought to come home." They held each other in the hotel hallway, two sisters who had nearly lost the chance to share this moment. Emma's wedding dress rustled against Sarah's bathrobe, and they both laughed through their tears at the incongruity of the scene. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you about the investigation," Sarah said, and she explained about Derek Molloy, about the deliberate sabotage, about how close they had all come to a very different ending. Emma listened in stunned silence, then shook her head in amazement. "So you didn't just overcome your fear of flying, you survived someone's attempt to kill you and then saved everyone else in the process." "I had help. Marcus, Jessica, Captain Torres, even Tommy, everyone contributed something. I just happened to be the one sitting closest to the controls." Emma smiled, the same mischievous grin she'd worn as a child when she was planning something adventurous. "Well, sister, I think that makes you officially the most badass maid of honor in wedding history. Are you ready to walk down the aisle?" Sarah looked at her bridesmaid dress, then at her sister in her beautiful gown, then out the window at the Rocky Mountains where, less than 24 hours ago, she had faced the greatest challenge of her life. "Emma, I'm ready for anything." 6 months after Emma's wedding, Sarah stood before a congressional subcommittee on aviation security, her hands steady on the microphone despite the imposing chamber filled with lawmakers, media representatives, and aviation industry officials. The hearing had been called to examine the vulnerabilities that Derek Molloy had exploited and to evaluate proposed changes to airport security protocols. "Senators, what happened on Flight 847 wasn't just about one disturbed individual," Sarah testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of systemic failures. "It was about gaps in our security systems that allowed unauthorized personnel to access critical aircraft systems. It was about the need for better training protocols for emergency situations. And it was about the courage of ordinary people who rose to extraordinary circumstances." The hearing room was packed with survivors from Flight 847. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, now serving as a consultant to the FAA on emergency procedures. Jessica Martinez was there with her husband and teenage daughter, having returned to flying after a brief leave of absence to process the trauma. Tommy, now 9 years old and still carrying Peanut, sat with his mother Linda, both serving as advocates for improved passenger safety education. Senator Patricia Collins, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward in her seat. "Ms. Chen, your actions that day saved 43 lives, but they also exposed serious questions about our aviation security. What recommendations would you make to prevent similar incidents?" Sarah had spent months preparing for this moment, working with aviation experts, security specialists, and fellow survivors to develop comprehensive proposals. Senator, I recommend 5 key changes. First, enhanced background checks in real time. Verification systems for all personnel with aircraft access. Second, expanded training for flight attendants and passengers in basic emergency procedures. Third, improved cockpit security systems that can detect and neutralize airborne contaminants. Fourth, mandatory simulation training for air traffic, controllers and passenger-assisted landing scenarios. And fifth, better mental health resources for aviation personnel to identify and address extremist ideologies before they lead to violence. The impact of Flight 847 had rippled far beyond aviation security. Sarah's story had become a case study in crisis management, taught in business schools and medical training programs. The Sarah Chen protocol was now standard procedure for passenger-assisted aircraft emergencies, with detailed checklists and communication procedures that had already been used successfully in 3 subsequent incidents. Dr. Patricia Nolan, Sarah's former therapist, had written a widely read paper about trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth, using Sarah's experience as an example of how confronting our deepest fears can lead to profound personal transformation. The paper had influenced treatment approaches for anxiety disorders across the country. Emma and David's wedding video had gone viral, not because of typical wedding moments, but because of Sarah's maid of honor speech, where she talked about courage, fear, and the importance of family. The speech had been viewed over 10 million times and translated into dozens of languages. Wedding planners now regularly referenced it as an example of how personal challenges could add deeper meaning to celebrations. The legal proceedings against Derek Molloy had concluded with his conviction on federal terrorism charges. During the trial, it emerged that Molloy had been part of a larger network of aviation security extremists who viewed commercial flying as a symbol of societal inequality. His arrest had led to the identification and prevention of 3 other planned attacks on civilian aircraft. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the quieter transformations in the lives of the survivors themselves. Marcus Webb had emerged from retirement to establish the Flight 847 Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on aviation safety education and emergency preparedness training. Working with the FAA and airline industry, the foundation had developed new protocols for passenger involvement in emergency situations and had trained over 50,000 flight attendants, pilots, and air traffic controllers in the past 6 months. What Marcus realized, Sarah explained to the congressional panel, is that aviation safety isn't just about professional crews. It's about empowering every person on an aircraft to contribute to everyone's survival. The passengers on Flight 847 weren't just victims of an attack. They were active participants in their own rescue. Jessica Martinez had become the public face of flight attendant safety advocacy. Her testimony about the lack of training for passenger-assisted emergencies had led to new FAA requirements for cabin crew education. She now traveled the country training flight attendants in crisis communication and passenger psychology. Drawing on her experience managing 43 terrified people while their aircraft was in mortal danger, Linda and Tommy had started a children's program called Brave Like Peanut, teaching kids about courage and resilience through storytelling and role-playing exercises. The program, now operating in over 300 schools, used Tommy's stuffed elephant as a mascot for facing fears and helping others. Tommy himself had become something of a celebrity, speaking at children's events about the importance of staying calm in scary situations. Tommy taught us something important that day, Sarah told the senators. Children often handle crises better than adults because they haven't yet learned that some things are supposed to be impossible. His calm acceptance of our situation helped everyone else manage their fear. Robert and Helen Morrison, the elderly couple who had held hands through the emergency, had become advocates for senior citizen emergency preparedness. Their story of 53 years of marriage and their grace under pressure had inspired retirement communities across the country to implement new safety training programs. Captain Torres, who had talked Sarah through the landing from Denver Center, had been promoted to Director of Emergency Operations for the FAA's Rocky Mountain region. She had overseen the development of new protocols for passenger-assisted landings and had personally trained the air traffic controllers, who had successfully guided 3 subsequent emergency situations. Captain Torres showed us that technology is only as good as the human beings who use it, Sarah explained to the committee. Her ability to remain calm, to break complex procedures into manageable steps, and to maintain confidence in our ability to succeed, those are uniquely human qualities that no automated system can replicate. The airlines themselves had undergone significant changes. The Flight 847 incident had accelerated the adoption of new security technologies, including real-time monitoring of aircraft environmental systems and enhanced passenger screening protocols. More importantly, it had sparked a cultural shift toward viewing passengers as partners in safety rather than passive cargo. Sarah's own transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic. She had left her position at UCSF Children's Hospital to become the Director of Emergency Medicine Education at the University of Colorado, where she developed new curricula for training medical professionals in crisis leadership. Her courses were now required for all emergency medicine residents and had been adopted by medical schools across the country. The skills that saved those lives weren't just about flying an airplane, Sarah told the congressional panel. They were about leadership under pressure, making decisions with incomplete information, and maintaining hope when the outcome was uncertain. These are skills that medical professionals, first responders, and anyone who might face a crisis can learn and practice. The changes went beyond professional training. Sarah's relationship with Emma had deepened in ways neither sister had expected. The wedding that had almost been overshadowed by tragedy had instead become a celebration of family resilience and the power of love to overcome fear. Emma and David had delayed their honeymoon to attend Derek Molloy's trial, wanting to understand the mindset that had nearly cost Sarah her life. Emma taught me something important too, Sarah reflected during her congressional testimony. She showed me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means loving someone enough to act despite your fear. I thought I was learning to fly that day, but really I was learning that the most important journeys are the ones we take for the people we love. The ripple effects continued to spread. Aviation museums across the country now featured exhibits about Flight 847, focusing not just on the technical aspects of the emergency landing, but on the human factors that made survival possible. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum had acquired the actual aircraft, which was now displayed with testimonials from all 43 survivors. Flight schools had incorporated the Flight 847 scenario into their training programs, teaching student pilots about the importance of clear communication and the potential for passenger assistance in emergencies. The scenario had become a standard part of airline training, with pilots learning how to effectively guide untrained individuals through basic flight operations. The congressional hearing concluded with Senator Collins asking Sarah about the long-term lessons of her experience. Ms. Chen, what do you want people to remember about Flight 847? Sarah looked out at the hearing room filled with survivors, families, aviation professionals, and policymakers. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a nurse afraid of flying to someone who had literally learned to fly in order to save lives, from someone who needed control to someone who had learned to trust others, from someone who avoided risks to someone who had taken the ultimate risk for people she barely knew. Senator, I want people to remember that ordinary individuals are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. I want them to remember that The passengers on Flight 847 weren't heroes because they weren't afraid. They were heroes because they acted despite their fear. And I want them to remember that sometimes the scariest moments in our lives lead to the most important discoveries about who we really are. The hearing ended with a standing ovation, but Sarah's real satisfaction came from the conversations. Afterward, Tommy, now taller and more confident, but still carrying Peanut, told her about his plans to become a pilot when he grew up. Linda had enrolled in nursing school, inspired by Sarah's example of how medical training could prepare someone for unexpected challenges. Marcus Webb, his silver hair now completely white, but his eyes still sharp with purpose, shook Sarah's hand. With the firm grip of someone who had found new meaning in retirement. "Sarah, you know what the best part of this whole experience has been? Watching 43 people discover they were braver than they ever imagined." Jessica Martinez hugged Sarah with the warmth of someone who had shared an impossible experience. "I've been flying for 22 years now, and I can honestly say that they changed how I see my job. It's not just about serving drinks and demonstrating safety procedures. It's about being prepared to help people discover strength they didn't know they had." As Sarah drove back to Denver that evening, she reflected on how different her life looked now compared to 6 months ago. The woman who had been afraid to board an airplane was now a nationally recognized expert in crisis management. The nurse who had avoided risks was now teaching others how to face their fears. The sister who had almost missed a wedding because of phobias was now someone who spoke regularly about the courage to love deeply enough to take necessary risks. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Watched the hearing on C-SPAN. So proud of you, sis. David and I have news we're pregnant. The baby is due in February. Think you can handle being Aunt Sarah without needing flight simulator training?" Sarah smiled and voice texted back as she drove. "I think I'm ready for anything now. Love you, Em. Can't wait to meet my nephew or niece." The Denver skyline appeared ahead of her, the mountains rising beyond it like ancient guardians. Sarah thought about the lesson she had learned that terrifying day above those same peaks, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in service of something larger than yourself. Love for family, responsibility for strangers, commitment to doing what was right even when you had no idea if you were capable of succeeding. She had faced her worst fear and discovered it had been hiding her greatest strength. And now, as she prepared to welcome a new generation of her family into the world, Sarah knew that the most important thing she could teach that child was the same lesson Flight 847 had taught her, that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could accomplish impossible things when they acted with courage, compassion, and love. The legacy of Flight 847 would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives for years to come. But for Sarah, the most important legacy was personal, the knowledge that she was capable of rising to any challenge, the confidence that came from having faced the unthinkable and survived, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that her courage had given 43 people the chance to continue their own journeys. As she drove toward her new life in Denver, Sarah Chen was no longer afraid of flying. She was no longer afraid of anything. 3 years later, Sarah knelt in the garden behind her Denver home, showing her 18-month-old nephew, Jake, how to plant wildflower seeds, the same mountain wildflowers that had decorated Emma's wedding 3 years ago. Jake, with his mother's adventurous spirit already evident in his determined attempts to eat the dirt, clapped his chubby hands as each seed disappeared into the dark soil. "Aunt Sarah, will the flowers really grow big?" asked 5-year-old Sophia, Emma and David's daughter from David's previous marriage, who had officially become Sarah's niece when the adoption papers were finalized 6 months after the wedding. "They will if we take care of them," Sarah said, brushing soil from her hands. "Just like people, they grow strongest when they have good soil, plenty of sunshine, and people who love them." Emma emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the comfortable smile of someone whose life had found its perfect rhythm. The family had moved to Denver 2 years ago when David accepted a position with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Service, bringing them closer to Sarah and allowing the sisters to share the experience of raising children together. The news crew just left, Emma announced, settling onto the garden bench that Sarah had built herself, another skill she'd acquired in her journey toward self-reliance. Channel 7 finished filming the segment for the 3-year anniversary special. They wanted to interview Jake too, but I told them he's not ready for his television debut. The anniversary of Flight 847 had become an annual milestone, not just for the survivors but for the aviation industry as a whole. The incident was now taught in flight schools, studied in safety courses, and referenced in emergency protocols worldwide. But for Sarah and her family, it represented something more personal, the day that changed everything. 5 years later, Dr. Sarah Chen walked across the stage at the University of Colorado's emergency medicine graduation ceremony, shaking hands with each new resident who had completed her crisis leadership program. The graduates' doctors, nurses, paramedics, and first responders represented 5 years of refined curriculum based on the lessons learned at 35,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. Remember, Sarah told each class of graduates, technical skills will get you started, but it's your ability to lead with compassion under pressure that will save lives. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Marcus Webb, now 73 and officially retired from his foundation work, sat with his wife Margaret, who had become one of Sarah's closest friends. Jessica Martinez was there with her partner Sandra and their twin daughters, both now kindergartners who knew the story of Flight 847 as a family legend about their mom's courage. Tommy, now 14 and captain of his middle school's aviation club, sat with Linda, who had graduated nursing school the previous year and now worked in pediatric emergency medicine at Denver Children's Hospital. Tommy still carried Peanut, though the stuffed elephant now lived in his backpack rather than being clutched constantly. The Brave Like Peanut program had expanded internationally, with chapters in 12 countries teaching children resilience. Through Tommy's story, Captain Torres, recently appointed as the FAA's Deputy Administrator for Emergency Operations, delivered the keynote address about the evolution of aviation safety culture. 5 years ago, passengers were considered cargo, she told the graduating class. Today, they're considered part of the safety team. That transformation began with the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. 8 years later, the Flight 847 Memorial at Eagle County Regional Airport was dedicated on a crisp October morning, exactly 8 years after the emergency landing. The memorial consisted of 43 trees, one for each person on board, arranged in a circle around a bronze sculpture of a mountain peak with outstretched wings. Sarah stood with the other survivors as the memorial was unveiled, watching as Jake, now 9 years old, and Sophia, now 13, ran between the trees with the easy joy of children who had grown up knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. Robert Morrison, now 86 and moving carefully with a walker, had traveled from Florida with his great-grandchildren for the ceremony. Helen had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before seeing the publication of their memoir, 55 Years and Counting, which had become a bestseller about love, resilience, and aging with grace. She would have loved this, Robert told Sarah as they stood before the memorial. She always said that day proved we were tougher than we looked. Derek Molloy had been released from federal prison the previous year after serving his sentence for terrorism charges. He had written letters to all the survivors apologizing for his actions, though most had not responded. Sarah had chosen to meet with him once, not for forgiveness but for understanding. The conversation had been difficult but necessary, confirming her belief that hatred and isolation led to dangerous choices, while connection and purpose led to healing. He was sick, she had told Emma afterward. Not mentally ill in a clinical sense, but sick with anger and disconnection. I think the most important thing we've done is create more connection, more community, more ways for people to feel they matter. 10 years later, the documentary 43, the Flight 847 story, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and critical acclaim. The film, directed by Sofia Restrepo, whose own mother had been inspired by Sarah's story to overcome her fear of flying, wove together interviews with all the survivors, archival footage from the congressional hearings, and reenactments of the emergency landing. But the most powerful moment in the film came when Tommy, now 18 and preparing to enter the Air Force Academy, presented Sarah with a surprise, a new stuffed elephant, identical to Peanut, that he had commissioned for her first grandchild. Emma and David's third child, Sarah Elena Chen Morrison, had been born the previous month and named for her aunt who had taught her parents that love was worth any risk. Peanut wanted your granddaughter to have a friend, Tommy explained as cameras rolled. Someone to remind her that she comes from a family of brave people. 15 years later, Sarah's retirement party from the University of Colorado was held in the same congressional hearing room where she had testified 15 years earlier. Now Senator Collins, who had chaired the original aviation security hearings, was presenting Sarah with a Congressional Gold Medal for her contributions to emergency medicine, education, and aviation safety. The room was packed with 3 generations of lives touched by Flight 847. Sarah's former students, now department heads and chief residents across the country, shared stories of how her teachings had prepared them for their own impossible situations. Aviation professionals described how the protocols developed after Flight 847 had prevented dozens of potential disasters. Marcus Webb, now 85 and using a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, gave the introduction. Sarah once told me that she thought she was learning to fly that day, but really she was learning that the most important journeys are the ones we take for people we love. What she didn't realize then was that she was also learning to teach others how to take those journeys. In the front row sat Sarah's extended family, Emma and David with their 4 children, ranging in age from 15-year-old baby Sarah Elena to 25-year-old Sophia, who had followed in her aunt's footsteps to become an emergency medicine physician. Tommy, now a decorated Air Force pilot and instructor, sat with his wife and twin sons, both of whom had been born on the anniversary of Flight 847, 15 years ago. I was just a nurse who was afraid of flying, Sarah told the assembled crowd. I thought courage meant having control, and I thought safety meant avoiding risks. What I learned that day is that real courage means acting despite uncertainty, and real safety comes from knowing we can count on each other when everything goes wrong. 20 years later, the 20-year anniversary celebration of Flight 847 was held at the newly opened Flight 847 Aviation Safety Center in Denver, a state-of-the-art facility that combined flight simulation training with emergency response education. The center, funded by donations from survivors and their families, had become a model for integrated safety training programs worldwide. Sarah, now 65 and officially retired, but still consulting on crisis management programs, walked through the center's main exhibit with her 5 grandchildren, ranging in age from 20-year-old Sarah Elena to 3-year-old Marcus, named for Marcus Webb, who had passed away peacefully the previous year. Grandma Sarah, tell us again about the airplane, asked 8-year-old Emma Rose, David and Emma's youngest, who had inherited her namesake's curiosity and FEARLES, S-Day, S. Sarah knelt down to her granddaughter's level, the same way she had once knelt to comfort Tommy during those terrifying moments in the sky. Well, Emma Rose, 20 years ago your grandma was very scared of flying, but she had to be brave because people needed her help. Were you really scared, Grandma? I was terrified. But I learned something important. That day being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done anyway, especially when people you love are counting on you. The exhibit around them told the story of Flight 847 through interactive displays, video testimonials, and artifacts from that day, including Peanut, Tommy's original stuffed elephant, now displayed in a place of honor as a symbol of childhood, courage, and resilience. Near the center's entrance stood a large plaque with the names of all 43 souls who had been aboard Flight 847, along with the inscription, "In recognition of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary courage when their community needed it most." 25 years later, Sarah Elena Chen Morrison stood at the podium in the same congressional hearing room where her aunt had testified 25 years earlier, addressing a new generation of lawmakers about the ongoing evolution of aviation, safety, and emergency preparedness. Now 35, the same age Sarah had been on Flight 847, Sarah Elena had become the director of the International Aviation Safety Institute, carrying forward the legacy of her namesake's courage and her family's commitment to helping others discover their own strength. 25 years ago, my Aunt Sarah was a nurse afraid of flying who found herself in an impossible situation, she told the committee. Today, because of the changes that began with Flight 847, we have protocols, training programs, and technologies that have prevented hundreds of potential disasters and saved thousands of lives. In the audience sat many of the children and grandchildren of the original Flight 847 survivors. Tommy's son Michael was now a commercial airline pilot and safety instructor. Jessica Martinez's daughters had both become flight attendants, carrying on their mother's tradition of serving passengers with dedication and preparedness. Linda's grandson was studying emergency medicine, inspired by the nurse who had comforted his grandfather during the scariest moments of his childhood. The ripple effects of that single day of terror and triumph continued to spread, touching lives and inspiring courage across generations and around the world. Sarah's story had become more than a tale of survival. It had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary challenges when they acted with love, determination, and faith in each other. 30 years later, on the 30th anniversary of Flight 847, a small ceremony was held at the original memorial at Eagle County Regional Airport. Sarah, now 75 and moving slowly but still sharp-minded, stood with the few remaining original survivors in the circle of 43 trees, now mature and strong, their branches reaching toward the Colorado sky. The memorial had become a pilgrimage site for people facing their own fears and challenges. Travelers from around the world came to walk among the trees and read the stories of courage etched in bronze plaques at their bases. The memorial guest book contained entries in dozens of languages, all sharing stories of how Flight 847 had inspired people to face their own impossible situations. "You know what I think about most when I come here?" Sarah asked Emma, now 68, and still her best friend and closest confidant. "I think about how scared I was that day, and how that fear almost kept me from doing what needed to be done. If I had let the fear win, if I had said I couldn't possibly land that airplane," Emma squeezed her sister's hand. "But you didn't let fear win. You let love win. Love for strangers who were counting on you. Love for family who was waiting for you. Love for life itself." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in the same purple and gold colors, Sarah remembered from that terrifying descent 30 years ago. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The woman who had been afraid to fly had learned not just to pilot an aircraft, but to navigate through fear toward courage, through uncertainty toward purpose, through crisis toward connection. The 43 trees rustled in the mountain breeze, their branches intertwined like the lives of the people they represented forever, connected by a single moment of shared terror and triumph. Forever proof that ordinary human beings could accomplish impossible things when they acted with courage, Compassion and love dot in the distance. A commercial jet traced its path across the darkening sky, its passengers safe in the knowledge that their aircraft was protected by protocols, technologies, and training programs that had emerged from the crucible of Flight 847. And somewhere on that plane, perhaps there was another Sarah, another ordinary person, who would one day discover they were capable of extraordinary things when their community needed them most. The legacy of Flight 847 lived on, not in monuments or museums, but in the countless acts of everyday courage it had inspired, in the lives it had saved, and in the enduring truth it had proved, that in our darkest moments, when everything seems impossible, love really can conquer fear. And ordinary people really can do extraordinary things. As Sarah and Emma walked back to their car, passing beneath the memorial's inscription one final time, Sarah smiled at the words she had helped choose 30 years ago, where silence is never forgotten and courage is always remembered. Behind them, the 43 trees stood sentinel in the gathering darkness, their branches reaching toward the stars, forever reaching toward hope.